Hello, my name is Meagan Stasiak, and I am a school psychologist with Region 9 that will be leading this presentation on BIPs 101 or Behavior Intervention Plans. This will be a general overview to describe what they are, the different pieces of them, and a little bit about how you might see them implemented or can't implement them in your school settings. I will try to keep this as close to the 1 hour mark as possible. Due to time constraints, I won't be able to go over every single component in depth, but I will be linking additional resources at the end, as well as throughout the presentation. And this will also include some free online trainings that you can follow up with for deeper understanding. We will also have a Google Drive shared with you that has a lot of the resources too. Disclaimer before we get into it, this presentation is based on current research and analysis, and it is intended for informational purposes only, meaning it is not legal advice. As you take in this information and think about how you can apply it in your own practice, please also take into consideration your district's policies and protocols regarding your specific situations when attempting to prevent and also respond to behaviors in your setting. To start off with, we need a little bit of a behavior refresher. So, behavior is learned and serves a purpose. It always has a function. Behavior is related to the context in which it occurs, the where and under what conditions. This is why we might sometimes hear parents say, well, that doesn't happen at home. The behavior is only occurring in school, and so that school is that where and under what conditions. If a problem behavior can be defined, explained, and predicted, there is also a likelihood that it can be prevented. If the replacement or desired behavior, what we want the student to do, can be taught to students, there is also a likelihood that the problem behavior can be decreased in the amount, frequency, and intensity of that problem behavior. When we take into consideration behavior and its function, it's really important that we understand the ABCs of behavior. This will include the setting event, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So the ABCs should have been discovered during that functional behavioral analysis, that FBA. That's what came before the BIP. So, a setting event is an event that can set up the behavior but happens outside of the normal routine, make it more likely the behavior may occur. This can also include underlying conditions or circumstances the student might have. So, a couple of examples, maybe the student has ADHD and they forgot to take their medication before they came to school. They're going to be a little bit more impulsive. They might behave a little bit differently that day. Maybe they're in a bad mood, or mom and dad got in a fight before school, so they're coming in already agitated or sad. Maybe the student has other health concerns that could impact some of the ways that they act or behave during the school day. Maybe the student has an underlying learning disability like dyslexia, so we know reading tasks are going to be very frustrating for this individual. The antecedent is the where and the when, that trigger, what happened right before the behavior. Now, sometimes there can be fast or slow triggers. And what I mean is like a fast trigger might be somebody says something nasty to a student, they get mad and punch them. That saying something nasty was that fast trigger. Sometimes it could be a slow trigger. Maybe they're just getting really annoyed with their peers and then they eventually say something rude, but that getting annoyed, peers are repeatedly saying things would be that slower trigger. The behavior is the what. That's that problem behavior, and we want to make sure that we define it in very specific, observable, and measurable terms so that everybody knows what we're talking about and it passes that stranger test. The consequence is the outcome. That is what happens right after the behavior occurs. Sometimes we call this the maintaining consequence. So, what is, encouraging that problem behavior to keep occurring in this type of situation? So, an example of this would be say we have a student with dyslexia. So, reading tasks are going to be very just frustrating for this individual. Being asked to read aloud in class is a time when the student will start talking out of turn, they'll make some inappropriate jokes. They do this repeatedly. The teacher gets frustrated. Eventually, the teacher's just like, you know what? Go out to the hall. You're done. In this situation, that setting event was that dyslexia. Was it making it more likely that the student was going to get frustrated? The being asked to read aloud in class is that antecedent, that trigger. That talking out of turn or making inappropriate jokes is the behavior, that problem behavior. And the being sent to the hallway is that consequence. And the reason it's maybe a maintaining consequence in this situation is when the student gets sent to the hallway, they might view it as got out of reading, got out of class, that's a win for the student. So unfortunately, in this situation, being sent out to the hallway is encouraging that problem behavior. So ultimately, when we put together these ABCs of the behavior, we're beginning to understand the function of the behavior or why that student is engaging in that behavior. So, what is a BIP? The BIP comes after that FBA, that functional behavioral analysis. So the school's conducted an FBA, the educational team has determined that that problem behavior is severe enough or intense enough that we need a specific action plan. So this specific action plan, or we could call it a blueprint, is going to be the BIP. And this is going to be a written plan that is designed to address the function of the student's problem behavior by giving us an outline of individualized strategies to prevent the problem behavior, teacher replacement behavior, and procedures to intervene if that problem behavior does occur again. This is also going to have guidance into who implements the strategies and procedures. It might also list if we need additional staff involved or additional training involved. The one other thing I do want to mention is that sometimes with our BIPs, we might have to have short-term and long-term goals, and I will get deeper into this later. But it's likely that we're going to have to review on this plan every 6 to 9 weeks. We might have to make revisions as we go. So it's going to be really important that everyone knows who's involved, what their piece of it is, and how to implement it. So our BIP team members are going to be pretty much everyone that might work with the student. Parents and guardians, relatives, teachers involved. Maybe you have other specialists at the school, a behavior specialist, maybe some counselors, maybe a school psychologist. Maybe the student is on an IEP and they receive other supports, speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, social work services. Involving anyone that works with the student would be helpful. Sometimes also there might be community support, so we want to keep in mind if any of them should be involved. If the student, for example, rides the bus and has issues there, we would want to involve the bus driver or assistants, whoever it is in those situations. The one thing I do want to key in on is that students are going to be a really crucial piece of this team because without student buy-in and participation, the plan's just not going to work. So we're going to have to get student buy-in, and there will be different strategies and ways we can do this that I will talk about a little bit later. But we also have to keep in mind how we cater that message of this plan or informing the plan to the student. And it's going to really come down to what is appropriate for them when we take into consideration their age, their understandings, maybe some of their abilities to perspective take on some of those skills. So sometimes, for example, with an older, maybe high school student, they could attend some of these BIP meetings or reviews, but there's also times that maybe the information might be harmful for them to hear if they take things very negatively, for example. So maybe we have the most of the heavy part of the meeting first without the student, and then at the end, bring them in to explain it. Or maybe we meet up with them one-on-one with a teacher or their mentor later to kind of explain some of the things that were talked about and get their input. Same thing with elementary school students. For a lot of them, this meeting will just be too long and it won't make sense. And so we will need to cater that message to them. The big piece is that we always want to send the message that this is a student success plan. We want them to succeed. And this is going to be a plan not just for the student, but also the teachers, because we need to work as a team to help them get to where they need to be. Another piece I want us to point out for staff is that BIPs can be confusing. Some of these documents can get pretty long, and so don't be afraid to speak up if something doesn't make sense or you don't know how to enact a part. I know for teachers and different educational assistants and therapists, we all have different backgrounds and training. So if you're being asked to do something in this plan that you haven't been trained on or you don't know how to do, speak up. So that way we can provide you the supports or the coaching or the training to make sure that we can do it. Another thing we want to keep in mind is as we're doing the different revisions and reviews of the BIP, we're going to be collecting progress monitoring data to track, how all of the interventions are going. And as we look at that data later, if we're seeing that something doesn't make sense or it's not working in your setting, make sure we have the data or the records to support when we bring those to the team so we can say, hey, this isn't working. We need to revise the BIP and try something else or do this instead. One idea for how to introduce BIPs to our students is a student behavior contract, which basically is a more simplified version of the BIP that's more student or child friendly. It's going to explicitly state the goal behavior, maybe how to do the goal behavior, rewards the student can earn, and maybe even possible consequences, if they have that problem behavior come out again. We want to make sure we introduce this to the student when they're very calm initially, discuss it with them. If there's certain items we can offer them choices on, that always helps just to give them that sense of control, like they also got a say in this. And then also talking a lot about those consequences and like why those might happen and what those will look like. I also like to have my students sign this. Every now and then with students, when you do have to deliver those consequences, you might get a little pushback. And so if you have like a little document like this that the student has clearly participated in and signed, we can revert back to that with a little bit extra help for the student to understand that this was something that they did agree with previously. We also want to reframe our thinking on BIPs. So, kind of like I said, we want to think of it as a student success plan. BIPs are not punishments. A big thing to keep in mind is that BIPs are not always just because a student is having physical or verbal aggression. They can also because maybe say like a student has panic attacks and that's like impacting their learning. Maybe they're avoiding work because of, low self-esteem or something like that going on. There's really a lot of reasons a student could be referred for a BIP. We also want to keep it conversational. So when we're introducing this student success plan, like I said, to the students, we could maybe phrase something like, I noticed that math seems to be really frustrating and hard this year. We want to make sure that school feels better for you, so we wanted to make a student success plan to help. Instead of throwing items when we get mad, we are going to try asking for a break when we feel frustrated. And then you can list, any supports they might be receiving, strategies, etc. Student and family buy-in also is going to be very important for the success rate. Like I already said, students are crucial. So the family piece, a lot of times behaviors that students exhibit at school, they also exhibit at home. So we want to make sure that parents are responding in the same way that we do at school because that will help increase the likelihood and the quickness of the student learning this replacement behavior. Sometimes we might have to educate parents on how to do this and maybe provide coaching. So checking in with them every now and then on, have you had to use any consequences or rewards in the home setting? Have they used the replacement behavior? Different things that we as a team might want to take into consideration. The other piece we want to think about is that BIPs are always a living document, meaning that there will be several editions before students master the new behavioral skill. So, kind of like I think I mentioned earlier, sometimes there's going to be short-term and long-term goals. So, another way we can think about this is when somebody wants to run, well, there's a couple prerequisite skills to learning to run. You have to know how to stand, you have to know how to walk, you have to know how to balance yourself, different things like that. So the same thing can be said with behaviors. There might be one overarching large behavior we're concerned about, but there might be smaller skills along the way that we need to teach before we can get that full replacement behavior understood and taught. The other thing to keep in mind is that, like I said, we will have a lot of revisions or additions to these documents. So if your first BIP needs changed, this is not a sign of failure. It's part of the learning process. It's like testing a hypothesis. Sometimes what you try the first time doesn't work. And so we have to look at our data and what we've tried and figure out a new solution to propose. New Mexico BIPs are comprised of 9 different parts that are listed here on this slide, and we will be going through all of these in the presentation. I also want us to keep in mind that when we have our first initial BIP, it's going to really be driven by that FBA data that we've collected. When we go to our future revisions or adjustments to the BIP, that's going to be driven by the FBA and that progress monitoring data that we're going to be collecting throughout our implementation of the BIP. So problem behavior and target goal are part one of BIPs. So The problem behavior section is typically going to start with some sort of referral statement or rationale of how we got here. So it's going to be a small description of the student for those that are not familiar with them. Why did we need a BIP? What was the interfering the problem behavior? Do they receive any other supports, school supports or outside supports, anything that would be really important for someone to know. There also may be multiple behaviors of concern captured throughout the FBA process. A lot of times when I'm conducting these, I will get, 6 or 7 behaviors throughout the school day that are a concern. Typically with our BIPs, though, we only want to focus on 1, 2, or 3 max behaviors that we want to replace. And the reason why we do that is we want to focus on the behavior that's the biggest, the most concerning, because a lot of times those smaller behaviors are actually a build-up to that one maxed out behavior. So if we tackle that largest problem behavior first, we will typically see those smaller ones fizzle out. And so it's going to be like a ripple effect. If we work on that big problem behavior first and getting strategies to that, those strategies are probably also going to be helping some of those smaller behaviors. Now, if for some reason, as we tackle that problem behavior and we notice, hey, there's something else that's cropped up or something else that isn't being teased out yet, we can look at changing some of our strategies or adapting the goal statement and further additions. Now, when we have the problem behavior stated, it should be stated very clearly and operationally with observable and measurable terms. Again, this should come out of that FBA. We want to make sure it passes that stranger test, meaning that someone who is completely unfamiliar with the student would be able to read the description and know exactly what that behavior is. So, what would you see and hear? In this table here, I have a couple examples. The left column are words that are just too vague and they could literally mean anything. So, some examples of things you might state instead are stated on the right. So, a big one I see, is a student is disrespectful or rude, but that could look like many different things. It could be a student using curse words directed at a teacher or peers, a student ignoring someone or not responding to their name when they're called, and we know that they don't have any hearing or auditory processing issues. It could also be, instead of saying throws tantrums, say specifically, drops their body to the ground or throws items or hits other students with their fists. Tantrums is a very vague term. If we've met any child, we know every child will throw a tantrum very differently. Next, we have the target goal, which will also include some baseline data. So, the target goal is what do we want to achieve or what we want the student to do. Initially, this might be a short-term goal, and then future revisions of the BIP may have the more advanced goal listed. Sometimes some teams might want to list more goals. It really just depends on your school, your setting, your protocol. So we will talk about this a little bit more under step 5 of the desired replacement behaviors. So baseline is collected before the BIP is written and lets us know where our starting point is. So this is what we're going to use to compare our future progress monitoring data to see if our BIP is effective. How do we know that we've met our target goal, basically? This baseline and the target goal can measure occurrences of the problem behavior, usage of the replacement behavior, or both. Again, it's going to be very clearly written in the BIP. And we will also talk about data collection later under step 9 when we get to progress monitoring. So part 2 of the BIP is we have to ask, is the behavior a skill deficit and or performance deficit? Again, this should also come out of the FBA, but to help us understand, a skill deficit is when a student cannot implement the replacement or desired behavior. So oftentimes they might lack communication skills, social emotional skills, executive functioning skills. So this is a student that's going to need very direct and explicit instruction on that skill. Sometimes an example might be a student that interrupts a lot. Maybe they have a communication delay or some social emotional delays. Maybe they're on the autism spectrum and they just aren't really sure how to navigate that situation. And so we might have to teach, social skills of how to understand when it's your turn to talk or how to ask for help appropriately. Maybe we need to teach a nonverbal way to request help while they're learning to hone all of these other skills. So really, you will just have to take into consideration your specific student and their needs. And if we are using a skill-based intervention, we have to prioritize that very direct, explicit instruction. For a performance deficit, this is where the student can sometimes do that replacement behavior, but they're not consistently doing so. So this is issues with generalizations. They're doing it in some settings, but not all settings. So when this happens, we're likely going to need to provide some sort of review or coaching of what we expect the student to do, and also provide regular feedback. And then also prioritize those antecedent-based interventions. So like what happens before that behavior, helps lead to that behavior. And then also reinforcement, like really rewarding them for using that replacement behavior. An example of this might be a student who has dyslexia and reading is really frustrating and they have a lot of outbursts during tasks that involve reading. But when they're in PE class, and let's say they lose a lot in PE, so they're also frustrated in PE, but we don't see them having these outbursts. So they do have some level of frustration tolerance, and they're able to do it in their PE class when they're upset, but they're not able to do it in classes that involve the reading tasks. And so this is where we would really want to review those skills with them and then coach them how to use them and check in with them a lot and provide supports that way. Next, we have part three, which is the presumed function or cause of the behavior. So, like we said, all behavior has a function. It's always trying to communicate something. All behavior falls under people trying to seek control in some capacity, but we can divide it further into to get or gain something or to escape or avoid something. So when we think of getting or gaining things, this could be attention, activity, stimulation. Examples could be I yell and others look at me. I got attention. I hit a kid and he gives me the toy I wanted. I get the object. Examples of escape or avoidance could be things like avoiding different tasks, demands, activities, people, being corrected. So this could be like I cry when writing is hard and the teacher helps me, or I don't have to do it. I kick my classmate and the teacher sends me to the hall. The one we want to keep in mind that gets a little bit complicated is that pain attenuation or alleviation. And this is where the function of a behavior is some sort of automatic reinforcement. And so the student might be engaging in the behavior because it alleviates some sort of pain or discomfort. And in these types of situations, because they are complicated, you're really going to need a specialist support. Could be a behavior specialist, maybe like an autism coach, maybe an occupational therapist, maybe a mental health consultant. It really just depends. But some examples could be biting your hand to mask a headache or cutting to alleviate anxiety or depression. Like I said, these ones are complicated, so make sure you have a very robust team and you have the right specialists in place in these sorts of situations. And then as a side note, sometimes there's multiple functions to a behavior. It's just really specific to your student. So, keeping in mind some immediate needs when we think about behavior is if the function is attention, we need to build rapport. And we have to get creative in how we build that rapport because we need to make sure that we're using it in a way that, whistles in, or talks in the right ear, like lets them know that we're there to support them in a way that they're going to be receptive to. And so you do have to get creative with that one. If the function is access to items or activities, we might have to teach them several things, like how antecedents and consequences can impact their behaviors, maybe recognizing themselves and their own like emotional states and their own triggers, teaching them communication skills or alternate behaviors, teaching them to delay gratification. How do I wait? That can be a really hard one for some of our kids. Maybe even the benefit of doing something now rather than putting it off. So maybe you could say, if I do this reading assignment earlier in the period, then you'll have free time at the end, or it won't become homework. And lastly, for escape and avoidance, we really have to teach the concept of balancing challenge and rest. And so maybe talking with the student, it's okay to feel challenged by the work, but if it's a hardship, that's different, and let's speak up about it. Staff should also be aware of different school deficits that a student might have and how that could play a role. We might need to talk to them about self-regulation. How do we know when we're getting to our tipping point and what can we do about that? Do I or don't I need a break so that I can come back to work with a better shot at learning? Really, a lot of different ways and methods that you can use to review, coach, and teach some of these skills. Part four of the BIP is going to be intervention strategies. And the New Mexico document does divide these into several different areas, the environment and or circumstances, curriculum and or instruction, and then other strategies and positive supports. And so all of these strategies we're going to use to find a way to adapt the school setting to reduce instances of the problem behavior or also teach that replacement behavior and reinforce it. So again, your strategies always have to be specific to the function of the behavior. Now, the one thing I do want to add too is anytime you see text that's white with an underline, that's going to be a linked resource. So you'll be able to click on that when you have a copy of this PowerPoint, or it will also be included in a Google Drive that will be shared. Different types of interventions you might see under Part 4 are skill-based, antecedent-based, and reinforcement-based. Typically, your BIP is going to have probably something from each of these, maybe numerous things from each of these areas. Again, it's going to really depend on your student. This is why a lot of our BIPs look different from student to student because they're very unique to each. So skill-based is we want to make the problem behavior inefficient. So we're explicitly teaching that student a replacement behavior or skill that meets the same need as the problem behavior in a faster or better way. So sometimes this might be like if a student has a communication or speech delay, we're going to explicitly teach those skills. Antecedent based is we're going to try to adapt that environment to make that problem behavior irrelevant. So a good example of this is a student that maybe gets overwhelmed by loud noises and tries to run away. Maybe we give them some noise canceling headphones, or maybe we warn them about, upcoming fire drills and things like that. Reinforcement based, we're also going to talk about this later when we talk about rewards, but we're going to try to make that problem behavior ineffective. Can we increase the reward or the payoff of that replacement behavior while also reducing the reinforcement of the problem behavior? A go-to example of this is going to be in-school suspension versus out-of-school suspension. I know this one is sometimes hard for schools to use, but a lot of times with our students, they don't like in-school suspension, but out-of-school suspension, they're like, I got to go home and play video games all day. Like, didn't mind that. So anytime we could make sure that the reward for that problem behavior is not going to be something the student wants, that might help us in the long run encourage them to use that replacement behavior. And of course, when we're considering interventions, again, always consider what a student can and cannot do. Even if there is a performance deficit, we will likely need to provide some sort of teaching or review of those desired skills to our goal. And also, we want to make sure that our interventions are, again, directly connected to that function, evidence-based practice. We don't want to just be throwing random things out there. We want to make sure that they align with the personal and cultural values of students and their families. We also want to make sure that they're feasible to implement at the school district with our staff and resources. And we also, again, we want to get that parent buy-in whenever we can. So, skill-based interventions. So, these are going to really focus on behavioral skills trainings. So, we're going to explain what the replacement behavior is, when to use it, and why it's important to learn. Then we're going to model, demonstrate what the replacement behavior looks like. We can incorporate a variety of examples, acceptable forms of the behavior, and even how others might respond to the behavior. Maybe we talk about different settings or conditions to use it. Sometimes students really like taking videos. So maybe if we're teaching the skill of, hand raising, we could model, this is how we do it in the classroom and it's very appropriate. But if we do this during, say, hide and seek, it's not an appropriate time. Everybody's going to find you. We also want to provide many opportunities to practice and receive feedback before using it in real time. So again, using a lot of those role-playing opportunities, maybe we set them up to do it one day in class, and then we immediately check in with them afterwards on like how it went, what worked, what didn't work, like how they feel about it. And then we want to keep reviewing those skills and supporting generalization. So I will also talk about this later, but sometimes assigning like a mentor or like having some check in, check out regularly with the students will be really helpful in helping them understand their progress, if there's anything we need to tune up or fine tune, things like that. And then lastly, when we're using those skill-based interventions and antecedent-based and reinforcement-based interventions should also be implemented. So, like I said, you're going to use all types of interventions. Antecedent-based intervention. So we can adjust the antecedents in many ways. Just a few things we might want to consider, modifying that personal space. Maybe we need to move their location closer to the teacher or away from sources of distraction. Maybe we need to deliver prompts. Maybe we have a signal so they know when a task they don't like is going to come up. So it can be a cue of like, hey, use some of your coping skills or like positive self-talk. Maybe we need to adapt the academic task. Maybe they can break it into smaller pieces. Maybe we give them easier items at first so that they can build confidence, and then we give them more challenging items. If handwriting's not the direct thing being assessed, maybe they can type the assignment. We could also offer choices, which is where we give very structured options to facilitate their ability to follow an instruction or make an appropriate choice. These probably will help if you preload them. So you can offer them two choices, but they need to be two choices that we want them to do. So maybe it's, would you like to do all the odds or the evens first? Okay, so our assignments today, we have to read and write and clean up. Which would you like to do first? They all have to get done, but maybe the order they do them in doesn't matter. And the big thing too is do not barter with the students on these moments when they're being used or offered. We just don't want to give the student too much gray space because then they might see that as like, oh, I got out of it this time. Maybe if I do this next time, I can get out of it again. Another thing you can do is provide space for that self-regulation. So kind of some careful things to keep in mind in these calm down spaces or calm down tools is if the student has never used these before or has a skill deficit in self-regulation, we really have to explicitly teach these and we'll probably have to provide a little bit of extra support for a while to make sure they know how to use them. This place can also not be used as a punishment, so it needs to be student choice. So again, offering those limited options to the student can be helpful too. Maybe saying something like, I see it looks like you're getting a little frustrated. Would you like to do half of the assignment, or do you think you need a break before you'd be ready to work? We also want to establish expectations and appropriate use with students beforehand. So again, at a time when the student is calm and regulated, we can talk about the different tools in the space. So one thing I sometimes tell my students is, this is a tool, not a toy. If it becomes a toy, we're going to lose access to it. And then lastly, you can also schedule non-contingent reinforcement. So basically, the student knows they're going to get this reinforcement or something that they like on a regular schedule, regardless of their behavior. So, for example, if a student's function is that they want more adult attention, maybe we do check-in, check-out systems with them throughout the school day. So the student knows every day I'm going to get one-on-one time with a teacher or staff person at the start of the day, before lunch, and at the end of the day. Sometimes too, you could also do regular breaks in academic work, especially if we know like math is frustrating. Maybe for every 20 minutes or 10 minutes, they get a minute break. Some other things we want to keep in mind is that students' behaviors may also be influenced by setting events here. So food insecurity, lack of home resources, etc. So if we suspect that is at play, we do want to work with related professionals and also the student and their family to access whatever resources they might need. Part five is desired replacement behaviors. So this should have already been written in the BIP. And like I said, it might change in future editions as they progress and master certain skills. We want to shift our focus to the desirable behaviors, what we want the student to engage in. So a positive alternate behavior that serves the same function as the problem behavior, functionally equivalent, like we've said. Think about communicating needs rather than engaging in a problem behavior to access that reinforcement or that reward. So we also want to consider and keep in mind that this problem behavior, when we're thinking about replacing it, we want the replacement behaviors to be more rewarding than the problem behavior. The replacement behavior should be socially valued across different settings and people. It needs to match the students' cultural norms and values. And we always want to attempt to involve that student input. Again, no buy-in, more likely failure of the BIP. It's kind of like if you're trying to change your diet and I don't know, cut out ice cream. If it's like a half-hearted attempt and I don't want to give up ice cream, well, I'm probably not going to stick to that diet. Some examples of functions and possible replacement behaviors. And again, this is just a few. There are many, many more options. But if a function is tension, maybe asking for help or attention could be a replacement behavior. Maybe learning to raise their hand. Maybe engaging in a task-related conversation. If items or activities are a function, maybe requesting more time. Requesting the item could be a replacement behavior. If escape or avoidance is the function, maybe learning to ask for help, maybe asking for a break, or even identifying their triggers and using those coping skills. So, a lot of different options you can use for each of these functions. So, as I have talked about a couple of times, and we'll get into deeper now, is sometimes we have to do a short-term and a long-term goal in developing those replacement behaviors. So maybe my problem behavior is when attempting a new task, the student shouts out in class or pushes items purposefully off their desk. I would love if we could just get this student to speak in an appropriate voice and also complete all of their assignments, but that's a very lofty goal. And if we're not doing any of those things right now, we probably have a couple of prerequisite skills we need to teach before we get to there. So maybe our first edition goal is that the student starts to recognize their triggers and then they start learning how to ask for a break when they're frustrated. Maybe our second edition, after they master that, is they self-regulate when they're frustrated and they attempt an alternate assignment. And then maybe the final goal, right before we would hopefully graduate or exit a student from a BIP, that final goal to achieve that would be that they keep an appropriate tone of voice and complete all of their assignments. Again, we would want to word the goal a little bit more specifically of that than that, but this is just a general example. So part 6 of the BIP is going to be the rewards and motivators. So this is where we think about our reinforcement-based interventions. So we want to make sure that the reinforcement of the replacement behavior should create a bigger, better, or more immediate payoff than the problem behavior. A lot of times we do this using differential reinforcement of the alternative behavior. So we're going to regularly and consistently reinforce that alternate behavior. Again, we're going to pay attention to what we want the student to do. And we're going to make sure that any place that problem behavior is a concern is that we're delivering this differential reinforcement. So any staff person or environment we're concerned about and we want that replacement behavior to be used, so they also need to get rewarded in those environments when they earn it. So rewards and reinforcers must be feasible, affordable, age appropriate, and complement the setting or environment. So what I mean by that is certain things might be appropriate to offer like an older child, but maybe not appropriate to offer a younger child, or um, we might want to keep in mind that we need to scale our rewards. So we don't want to offer that pizza party from the get-go. I think every student would love a pizza party, but if you offer that right out the door, then they're going to expect that to be offered every time. So maybe something large like that might be more of a culmination of like when you're graduating from the BIP, you can earn this pizza party, but you're not getting one every Friday. Also, another thing to keep in mind when scaling your rewards is if you think there's going to be several editions of the BIP, maybe some of your initial rewards might need to be easier things to give students. So I have an attached link with a bunch of examples, but it could be like maybe pencils or a lunch line pass or even picking who they sit with one day. We also want to make sure that the rewards are meaningful and motivating to the student. So a good way to do this, you can get input from the student, you can get input from the parents. I personally really like to do a forced choice reinforcement menu, or it's an interest inventory where basically the student is asked different, do you prefer this or this? And then they get asked the same thing over and over to really force them to pick which one they find more rewarding. And then at the end, you can figure out, do they like the adult approval, competition, peer approval, independent rewards, consumable awards? It really just depends on the student. And then also, effective reinforcers will change over time. And why I say that is sometimes, with our little kids, they love a treasure box, but not every kid likes a treasure box. So, really make sure that we're taking into account what they like. Recess is another good example. A lot of kids like to work for, an extra recess time, but that might not be rewarding in the winter when it's cold out. So, we might need to do maybe seasonal rewards. Sometimes I will do reward menus with the students. So I'll give them a list of like, these are things that are feasible that we can offer you. Like, pick three or four. And for this month, these can be the options, or this week, the options that you can work towards earning. Another thing to keep in mind is if we track rewards, like when we're giving them to the student or when the student achieves them, we could also use this data to help us track which rewards are rewarding to them, but also how often they're using that replacement behavior, since that's when they're earning the reward, which we can then use for progress monitoring. So there's a lot of ways that you can collect data and use it in multiple capacities. So types of reinforcers. So they need to be unique to the student. So remember that function of your problem behavior. So when we're thinking about a student whose function is social or attention, they might really like that verbal praise or like getting to sit with a peer or getting to do a project with a peer. Again, that check-in, check-out system or like mentoring could also be helpful for them. Activity or privilege related. Maybe they would like working towards computer time or time to read a book. Maybe they're wanting something more tangible. So stickers, school supplies could be good options there. Some possible, reinforcers for attention. If they're seeking attention, they could make sure that we respond really quickly when they ask for help. And that doesn't have to be like checking in with them. It could be like a signal. Like maybe you guys have a secret, I don't know, bat signal that you guys do to each other or something, kind of like a register, like I see you, I'll be there as soon as I'm done with the student. Giving them really regular attention for any appropriate behavior. I know with some of our students, maybe setting yourself a timer like during tasks that are hard for the student. I'm going to check in with them, whether it's verbally or visually, like every 5 minutes. And providing more opportunities for peer interaction can be another good one. Escaping attention. Maybe they would prefer like nonverbal check-ins, maybe a post-it note. Maybe they want to have the opportunity to earn time to just do something solo, or maybe they like working on projects on their own. So is there a way that if it's not necessary that they work in a group or like a small group, they could work solo on an item? Next, we have reinforcement schedules. And so anytime we're using rewards, we do need a plan to deliver that. So we always want to, first of all, pair our rewards with behavior specific praise. So that way the student really understands why they're earning the rewards. So this could be something like, I noticed you raised your hand and waited for help. You earn a gold star for that. We could also use token economies. And so I do have a article linked here that will also be shared specifically on what token economies are. And so basically students can earn stamps or, flowers in this example, and every time they get five, then they earn a reward. And again, the rewards don't have to be big. It could sometimes be like a handshake. It could be free time. It could be a treasure box, pencil. Really just depends on your student. And we can combine that again with that behavior specific praise. So I will say initially when we are introducing these BIPs, we really, really need to reinforce every single instance of that replacement behavior being used, meaning they might earn more rewards for the first couple of days just to really get that student's interest and the buy-in. And then once they show success, we can look at, gradually decreasing the reinforcement. Maybe they were getting every fifth flower reward. Okay, we did so good with that. Like, let's try to get to 10 flowers, then we get that reward. We also are going to want to include guidance on what to do if a student engages in a problem behavior. And we will talk about that a little bit later under part 7. So, little note for when rewards are implemented. Like I said, we want to do it consistently as planned and scheduled, because right now the concern is if we're doing it, let's say the student has issues in math and science. If only the math teacher is giving them rewards and they're not getting their rewards in science when they do the replacement behavior, well, that's going to cause issues to the whole system because they're going to be like, well, I don't have to do it in science then. We always also, like I said, want to state that behavior specific praise so the student knows why they are earning that reward. And again, we don't want to negotiate rewards on the spot with the student. So instead, we want to stick to that identified plan. This is where we can use that behavior contract if we need to, again, refer to that document that the student has already agreed to. If the student is really pushing, something we can say to them is like, hey, like, that sounds like a great idea, or that sounds like an idea we need to discuss later. I'm going to write this down. And when we do the next review, maybe we can take that into consideration. And another thing is basic needs should never ever be rewards. Water, meals, restroom, etc. Those are basic human rights. We're just not using those as rewards. That would be not good. So I also have some criterion specific reward examples listed here, where if a student's function is that they really like social things or they want activity or privileges, just a list of different ideas, a little bit of cautions to keep in mind, tangible rewards. And lastly, I know I mentioned this before, but scale your rewards, keep them feasible. We really want to save that biggest reward for the end, and we really need things that are capable and feasible for our settings, things that we can carry out and other teachers can carry out too. So part 7 is consequences. So consequences sometimes can be a little bit hard for our students to hear. So again, this is where maybe having a behavior contract might be helpful for them to understand that if this problem behavior occurs, this is exactly what's going to happen. Because we want to stay away from those previous maintaining consequences that were identified in the FBA. So we want to focus on shaping a student's problem behavior towards that replacement behavior. Again, students, when they're calm, when this plan is first introduced, we really need to pre-coach them on the consequences in a developmentally appropriate way. If this problem behavior occurs, like this is how staff is going to respond, and this is why. This is also really going to depend on what the problem behavior is and the severity of it as far as what the consequences are. I will also say keep in mind logical consequences. So, what I mean by logical is sometimes we might use something called a you break it, you fix it mentality, where those responsible for the problem might take responsibility for fixing it. So, maybe if a child destroys a teacher's board, the child is, after they're calmed down and regulated, the child is coached in how to apologize to the teacher. Maybe they help clean up the board area or they help clean up the next day. Maybe they help the teacher redo the board if the teacher wants that. Another one is loss of privilege. If they're misusing an item, the child immediately will lose access to that item for a brief period of time. And then later, when they're calm again, we can talk about, why they lost the ability to be line leader. Well, we were tripping other kids, and so that's not safe behavior. And so if we can't be responsible and safe being line leader, then we're not going to get to be line leader for that period. We can also do what is called a positive timeout, or sometimes it's called space and time, where you take a break to calm down or self-regulate. So maybe saying, hey, I see you're mad. Would you like a minute to reset? Hey, I can see you said something hurtful that you didn't mean. Do you want to take a break and reset? Give them maybe a face-saving moment. And again, this will really depend on the severity of the behavior. Obviously, if a student hits someone, they're not going to get a reset like that. Educators should also consider if the problem behavior will result in severe classroom disruption and how to intervene and or provide additional support. So if a behavior is severe or a safety concern, there must be a crisis plan. And we will talk about that a little bit here. Just a couple of examples of different consequences, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just a few, but if a student is trying to escape a task, maybe they complete an alternative task, maybe they complete a reduced task, maybe they do it in alternative environment. If they're wanting to gain attention, maybe if it's a small behavior, we can use planned ignoring. Or remind them to use that replacement behavior and then praise them when they do. If they want to gain an item, maybe we have to withhold that item or prompt them to use that replacement behavior first. Now, if you do prompt them to use the replacement behavior first and it happens to be like requesting the item, we do need to make sure then they get it. That follow through will be important. If they're trying to escape sensory, maybe we provide some sort of sensory alternative, whether that be noise canceling headphones, felt under the desk, wiggle stool, etc. And with wiggle stool, I do want to point out, just because I've seen this before, is a lot of times that can be very core engaging for students. So even if they have a wiggle stool, we want to make sure that they also have other alternative seating that is not as demanding, because sitting in one of those all day for some of our students can be very tiring. So, suggestions for check-ins with students after a consequence was delivered. Again, depending on our student, we're going to be very unique to each, but they may require check-ins post-consequence for understanding. So when we do this, we want to wait until the student is regulated and in a calmer state. Sometimes we can do this right after the episode, sometimes later in the day, or sometimes it might have to be the next school day. It really just depends on your student and the situation. Some examples of things when you do that review, that check-in, you could discuss, what happened? What went wrong? Use it as like a coaching teachable moment. Why the consequence had to be given. Good part to refer to the behavior contract if that was used. What can we do next time? Or what signals did we miss in our body to show us that we were upset? And then do we need to apologize to anyone or rectify the situation in some way? Just an example of how it might be written in the BIP. For this example student, Johnny, we said the consequences for his repeated occurrences of the problem behavior is he's going to be calmly redirected, reminded of his options. If it continues to persist, he's going to lose access to that activity or privilege. We're going to explain it to him. It's going to be for a period of time. If it's continued, he will be required to make it up later during their free period. And then when he has self-regulated after the incident, we talk about using those restorative practices. And then just as like a safety for the school at the end, we did mention that they will be subject to the school and class discipline policies and procedures. Part 8 is crisis plans. So, what this looks like will really be determined by the student and what their behavior of concern is. So, not all students are going to need like a full, robust safety plan. It might just be follow district behavior or discipline policy. However, if their behavior can be dangerous to themselves or others, we got to have a really robust plan for safety. Some of these possible concerning behaviors could be, purposeful hitting, kicking, biting of others, running out of the building or just running out of the room, self-injurious behavior, setting fires, threats, throwing items. Honestly, any behavior that you are concerned could injure that student or others around them. An example of a robust crisis plan is listed here. So we talked about, if Johnny's behavior creates an unsafe environment, i.e., you could reference that problem behavior here that you're concerned specifically about. And so we have what class staff will do. We also have what school personnel will do. Um, if room evacuation procedures, for instance, in this one are used, make sure everyone in the school knows how to do that. You might even have to practice these with your classroom. Maybe you have a code word that when the teacher says tulip, they're going to know that means you line up and you line up quickly. Johnny will also be subject to school and class discipline policies and procedures. Sometimes we might list, law enforcement will be contacted if that immediate danger or property damage is concerned. Maybe there might be threat assessments depending on what's said. Parents also will always be contacted. A lot of times with these really robust crisis plans, you want to talk to your school team about what you want to be in these. A lot of times, different protocols or procedures you have at school might drive some of this information. And then I always like to touch on post-crisis procedures, like what's going to happen immediately after, how are you going to document the incident, are you going to need a review meeting? Are you going to need any sort of restorative practices? These are all things we can think about and capture here. And the more clearly this plan is written, the easier it will be to follow because everyone will just know, like, if this happens, here's where we go with that. The next thing we're going to get into is BIP implementation. A really big thing I want to mention is something called the extinction burst. So, unfortunately, when we first implement these BIP interventions, that problem behavior is likely going to get worse before it gets better. This is called the extinction burst. And the reason that happens is because that original behavior pathway is being interrupted. But that's what we want. This is actually a good thing. So eventually, the child is going to learn that these problem behaviors are not going to be rewarded and they are ineffective, thus forcing them to use that replacement behavior to access that reward or that need that they have. So I do have a visual here of a student with a texting example, but I think an even better example is when we think about when we've used elevators in the past. So typically, when we go to the elevator, we will press the up button. The elevator comes, we get on, we go where we need to go. In our previous history, that pushing the button is the reward. It's that history of reinforcement. We get on the elevator and up we go. However, one day we press the elevator button, elevator does not come. Our reaction is that we just start frantically pushing that button over and over, trying to call that elevator because this has worked every time before. However, at one moment, we're going to say, hey, this isn't working. Doesn't matter how many times I push. The oh, it isn't coming, this isn't working button, that is our extinction burst. We stop pushing the button. We know it's not going to work. One other thing we want to keep in mind with this is some of our kids might have bigger extinction bursts than others. So, kind of like what we talked about, we have like safety concerns with physical, verbal outburst, destruction, thing like that. We might need to consider in the crisis plan how to support this. So, maybe we might need, I don't know, if, for example, a student is more likely to have outbursts during certain activities, and we know that we're introducing that activity on a certain day during this initial phase. Maybe we have an extra EA on the room, or we make sure the teacher has some sort of way to quickly call for help should they need it. It really just depends on your student and their situation. So, BIP implementation. A BIP is only as good as its implementation. Consistency and fidelity are key. So, fidelity is how faithful we are to the plan. It also includes, has the student even had enough situations to demonstrate that replacement behavior? We also need to ask ourselves, as far as our staff, do they understand the procedures? And if not, do we need to train them on it? If we get a new staff in the middle of the school year, do they also probably need trained on it? Little things to keep in mind. Also, the plan needs to be regularly followed every day in all settings where that plan is needed. Environmental factors also can impact the effectiveness of the plan. If there's a big holiday or a lot of absences, changes in routines, new schedules, maybe coming back from Christmas break, they need a little bit of extra coaching and review on what their behavior contract was, how to use their strategies, things like that. We also want to check in with parents too. Are they still using the same strategies at home? Do they have questions? What's working? What isn't working? And then lastly, if very critical elements of the plan are altered or omitted, then the intervention's not going to work as expected. So monitoring that implementation fidelity is also an important piece to make sure that plan is being used as intended. And again, I mentioned here, having that behavior contract with students can be really helpful because they can very much understand then what their role is in this plan. So progress monitoring. Like I said, BIPs are not static documents. They are living documents. And so our data collection will be driven by the behaviors being tracked. Like I said, you can track usage of that replacement behavior, maybe when we see that problem behavior, maybe both. So once our interventions are in place, the BIP team should regularly review the data on those different factors we are tracking. Typically, we're going to recommend doing that at least once per day. Sometimes those behaviors don't occur, and you can just say, no issues today, or however you would phrase it in your setting. Also, keep in mind that in some cases, our BIP and IEP goals are similar, and in these cases, you could use your BIP progress monitoring data also for your IEP progress monitoring data. Again, only when they're clearly aligned. If you are not sure, you need to talk to your BIP and your IEP team. So, an example of this would be if I have a BIP goal that's about decreasing work avoidant behavior, And then I have an IEP goal that's about increasing on-task behavior. Those are two very similar things that fall in the same area. So that would be a situation where you could use that BIP monitoring data also for the IEP. And again, whatever way we choose to collect our data, we want to make sure it's very observable, measurable, and actively stated. So a couple different methods or ways of collecting that data collection. So we've got systematic direct observation. So we've got frequency recording where we document the number of times a behavior occurs during a given period. So maybe it's looking at how many times they raise their hand in class. Could be an example. We also have event recording, and this is documenting more specifics or kind of like a behavior log on the instance of the behavior. So, thinking about ABC charting, I do recommend this one if the behaviors are more aggressive or intense due to the complex nature. The other side of this too is if you do have to do, say, an office referral, this would give you very clear information for an office referral. An example I use during FBAs, and you can also use for some of this tracking, is you do event recording where you have like the setting, date and time, the activity or task, possible triggers or antecedents, the specific behavior. You can preload this if you're, judging homework completion, for example, or let's see. Oh, the other ones I put more descriptions, but there's many different ways. You can add options if your child has specific behaviors they tend to repeat. And then whatever outcome or consequence they got following. There's also interval recording, which is where you document whether a behavior occurred during brief intervals. So you can do a time sampling with this, where you only record during a specific sample of time. An example of this might be, say I have a student who struggles in group projects. Well, I'm not going to monitor their whole school day. I'm only going to take the screenshot or monitoring when they're doing that group work to see, maybe it's did they keep their hands to themselves or did they participate? And you can mark on this uh, form, whether it happened during the allotted time or not. We also have duration recording, which is how long they engage in a behavior. So this one, for example, could be maybe they were on task from 1:13 to 1:17. Maybe they were crying and they shut down from 1:13 to 1:17. So maybe it took them 4 minutes to self-regulate. Latency is the amount of time that elapses between a direction or a prompt that's being given and the student following the prompt. So maybe you have a stopwatch, is what they used in this example. And so you give them a two-step directive, and it took them that long to actually start the first step. Again, the method that you use to record your progress monitoring data is going to be driven by whatever your target goal is. Some other ways you can record some of these, like frequency. I've seen teachers do the paperclip trick where you have maybe a handful of paper clips in your right pocket. Maybe you need to monitor them during only social studies. And so every time they leave their seat without asking or talk out of turn, you move a paper clip from the right to the left. And then at the end of that period, you count however many are left in the left. And that is your frequency recording for that period. Um, you can also keep a post-it handy. I've also seen moving like rubber bands from like one wrist to another. It really just depends on your style. And you don't have to record like every single period of the day for these. It's just when you want those systematic direct observations. Another piece that you can also use in addition to those systematic direct observations is something called permanent product. And sometimes this one's a little bit easier in the school setting to carry out. And so you're going to select a product or a result that indicates the occurrence of the problem or the replacement behavior. So maybe if they're not completing their work and their goal is to complete more work. We track daily or weekly a log of all their missing assignments and all their completed assignments or what percentage got completed. Sometimes we will also do check in, check out, where the student gets some sort of mentoring throughout the day. Sometimes the student will carry this with them. Sometimes it's more of a check-in if they have the same teacher every day and the teacher records it for them. And so, did they, for this example, did they keep their hands and feet to themselves? Did they follow directions? Did they use materials appropriately? Keeping it really specific to whatever the student's goal is. Again, this one's a little vague, so I would want to cater this to whatever that student's goals specifically are. We can also do daily progress reports. This one typically is some of my older students, but something along a similar vein. Again, this one's here as a better example. We want to be as specific as possible, and we want to make sure it's specific to the student. So if they're, completing work is not a concern for them, but following directions is, or using kind words is, we would only use those categories. And the nice thing when you use those check in, check out, you can provide coaching whenever you meet up. Maybe it's in the middle of the day and be like, the morning was a little rough. What can we do to turn the day around? Or are you doing okay today? Like, is there a way that we can help you be able to do what you need to do in the school setting? And sometimes too with our older kids, graphing this can be really helpful for them so they can see like, oh, I'm doing really good this week, or "Oh, I had a bad day, but like look at this other week, I turned it around. Like I can do that again." Really just using that as a really coaching, teachable moment. Lastly, we want to always regularly review the data. So teams need to plan regular times to meet and review this progress monitoring data. And this is going to depend on the replacement behavior and the severity of that problem behavior. So typically, when we have that initial BIP, I would recommend around like a 4-week review, just because you want a quicker review to make sure that that initial plan is actually working and is helping. However, if that problem behavior is a pretty severe safety concern, you might want to do an initial review 2 to 4 weeks after, running from the classroom or having like a lot of physical aggression would be things we'd want to tease out as fast as possible, or at least have a very clear, um, functioning response plan. And then after that initial review, for safety concern behaviors, typically you want to review those a little sooner with the data, so every 4 to 6 weeks. If it's not a safety concern, you could look at every 6 to 9 weeks. But again, you can change these review weeks based on your needs. And also, if the team is collecting data and they're like, something's off, something's weird, you don't have to wait 6 to 9 weeks. You can contact your BIP team person and be like, yeah, I think we need to meet sooner. Like, something's not happening. So at the review sessions, they can involve the parent and the school staff working with the student. Sometimes they could involve the student. Again, it's really going to depend on what's developmentally appropriate for that student. Sometimes with parents, they want to be an active part of these review sessions. Sometimes parents will say, yeah, I'd rather just come if you're actually changing the BIP. So reach out to parents on this piece. I know we're reviewing a lot more often on these, and so just being very open and honest with families, I think is best practice here. So at these review sessions, you're going to want to examine that progress monitoring data, determine if we need to make any adjustments or changes to any of the approaches. Sometimes you might even just be saying like, "Hey, the plan is working. Keep it the same. Carry on." So I know making decisions can be a little confusing. So I do have a helpful if-then table that reviews how you'll know if your interventions are successful, because the evidence will show it by this. If they've been inconsistently successful, you'll know by this, and then some recommendations of what to do next. And then if they've not been successful, what you could also look at checking. Due to time constraints, I don't want to go too long. I will let you guys review this on your own, but always feel free to reach out if you have questions. Now, if we do need to revise our BIP or make any changes, always state that in the rationale and somehow save that plan. Whether you're doing a completely new one, make sure the old one is saved, or if you're editing in the document itself, just make sure you know what day these revisions are going into effect and that it's documented somewhere. And that can be done several ways that you will have to talk to your school district about. Now, if you want to measure fidelity more closely, I did list a link for a website that kind of explains more how to do that. We've also got a couple different forms that are just general examples on how to track, if the student was taught the replacement behavior, if they had used consequences, if they actually used it in action, and like how that went with all of the different parties involved. Now, I do have, like I said, a lot of additional resources. I think the one that might interest you the most is I did include an article about the data collection methods that I was talking about earlier, and it's got more specific examples with special considerations. So this could be really helpful if you're trying to figure out that progress monitoring piece. Otherwise, all of these are here for your support. If you're interested in that check in, check out, this also is a very, very extensive manual that just breaks it down. Honestly, the most broken down I've seen. So it's very helpful. Resources that were used in making this presentation. And the last one I really want to point out is if you're not sure how that behavioral escalation cycle can work, I would really recommend this Iris Vanderbilt resource on understanding challenging behaviors. It is free and it breaks down, what happens. The students calm, they get triggered, there's that state of agitation, it'll accelerate, it'll hit that peak, that top, and then it comes the de-escalation and recovery, and it just talks about what that can look like and different strategies for different components of this. Thank you so much for your time. And like I said, there will be some other resources that have not, if they haven't been shared with you, they will be shared with you. So please follow up if you have any questions. Thank you for your time.